The office was quiet the day it happened, the kind of heavy silence that follows when everyone knows something is wrong but no one dares to speak. Michael sat at his desk, staring at the blank monitor in front of him, his thoughts still reeling from what had just occurred. Just an hour earlier, he had been called into his boss's office, a sleek glass-walled chamber at the end of the hall that overlooked the city. He had walked in with confidence, but walked out stripped of everything. His boss, Richard, had barely looked him in the eye when he delivered the news. "I'm letting you go, Michael. Effective immediately." The words had been clipped cold, almost rehearsed. Michael had stammered in shock. He had been with the company for 7 years, had given his all to it, had sacrificed weekends, holidays, even relationships just to meet deadlines and exceed expectations. And yet, Richard had cut him off with a dismissive hand, not even granting him the dignity of an explanation. But Michael knew the truth. Richard wanted him gone not because of poor performance. Michael's numbers were some of the best in the firm, but because Michael had spoken up in a meeting a week earlier. He had questioned Richard's strategy, pointing out flaws in a project that could have cost the company millions. He hadn't meant it as an attack, only as a caution, but Richard, proud and power-hungry, had taken it as a humiliation. Now, Richard had found a way to justify Michael's dismissal, masking it as downsizing. As Michael packed his things into a small box, he felt the burn of humiliation in his chest. Around him, colleagues avoided his gaze, afraid of being associated with him. His reputation, his hard work, all erased with one unfair decision. He carried his box out of the building and into the rain, his heart heavy, but even in that moment of despair, something inside him shifted. He knew he couldn't just walk away. Not after all he had given. Not after the way Richard had discarded him like trash. At first, Michael tried to move on. He applied for jobs, went to interviews, but everywhere he turned, he was met with subtle rejection. It didn't take long for him to discover why. Richard had been poisoning his name in the industry, whispering that Michael was difficult, insubordinate, unreliable. Every door he knocked on had already been closed by Richard's influence. That was when Michael's grief hardened into something sharper. If Richard thought he could destroy his career, Michael would show him what destruction really looked like. Revenge wasn't just an idea anymore, it was his mission. Michael started small, gathering information. He still had friends inside the company, people who trusted him and despised Richard's arrogance. Through quiet conversations and discreet favors, Michael began collecting fragments of truth, documents, emails, evidence of Richard's corruption. It turned out Richard had been siphoning company funds for personal luxuries, covering his tracks with doctored reports. He had manipulated accounts, bribed minor officials, and silenced anyone who raised concerns. Michael pieced it all together with the meticulousness of a man who had nothing left to lose. But he didn't rush. He knew timing was everything. Instead of handing the evidence over immediately, he let Richard grow bolder, greedier. He watched from the shadows as Richard flaunted his wealth, buying a penthouse, throwing extravagant parties, bragging about his invincibility. The higher Richard climbed, the further he would fall. Finally, the moment came. Michael anonymously sent the dossier of evidence to the company's board of directors, as well as to a major newspaper known for exposing corporate corruption. The explosion was immediate. Overnight, Richard's empire crumbled. The board called an emergency meeting, the press swarmed the building, and government investigators descended with warrants. Michael didn't need to be there to witness the chaos, but he went anyway. He stood across the street, watching as Richard was escorted out of the building in handcuffs, his once immaculate suit disheveled, his face pale with shock. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and the man who had thought himself untouchable was reduced to a headline: CEO arrested in corporate fraud scandal. Michael felt no guilt, no hesitation. He hadn't created Richard's downfall. He had only revealed the truth Richard had buried. But for Michael, the true revenge wasn't in seeing Richard disgraced. It was in what came after. The company, desperate to rebuild its reputation, reached out to Michael. They wanted him back, not as an employee, but as a consultant to help clean up the mess Richard had left behind. The irony wasn't lost on him. He returned to the same building where he had once carried a cardboard box in shame, but this time, he walked through the doors with his head held high, no longer a pawn, but a man who had outlasted and outsmarted the very boss who had tried to destroy him. His revenge wasn't loud or violent, it was legendary. He hadn't just taken back his dignity, he had ensured that Richard's name would forever be remembered as a cautionary tale of arrogance and greed, while his own would be remembered as the man who exposed the truth. And as Michael sat in his new office overlooking the city, he allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Richard had fired him unfairly, but in the end, it was Richard who was erased, and Michael who rose from the ashes stronger than ever. Richard thought firing Michael was the end of it. In truth, it was only the spark that lit a fire he would never escape. Michael had lost his job, his reputation, and for a time, even his sense of self. But a man with nothing left to lose is more dangerous than a man with everything to protect. And Michael knew patience. For weeks after his dismissal, he made no move, no noise. He let Richard think he had won. That silence was his camouflage. In the meantime, Michael reinvented his days. He spent mornings in cafes with his laptop, researching corporate law, fraud cases, and whistleblower protections. Afternoons were spent meeting quietly with former colleagues over coffee, their bitterness toward Richard giving them loose tongues. By night, Michael pieced together the puzzle on his kitchen table: spreadsheets, contracts, financial statements, and the whispers of corruption that had always lingered in the air but never been proven. The more he uncovered, the more he realized Richard's empire wasn't built on brilliance, but deceit. Kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. Inflated invoices. Shell companies siphoning money offshore. Richard hadn't just wronged Michael, he had been wronging everyone, from his own employees to shareholders, all for the sake of greed. Still, Michael knew a simple reveal wouldn't satisfy him. He didn't just want Richard caught. He wanted him to feel the same helplessness, the same hollowing dread that Michael had felt when he walked out of that office with his career in a cardboard box. Revenge had to be personal, so he set the stage carefully. The first strike was subtle. Richard received an anonymous email late one night. No sender, no signature. Just a single sentence. "You built your empire on lies." Richard brushed it off at first, but when the second email arrived days later, this time with a copy of one of his falsified invoices attached, he began to sweat. Michael escalated slowly. An envelope appeared on Richard's desk with no return address. Inside, a photo of Richard at one of his secret parties, surrounded by luxury he couldn't explain on his official salary. Then a note slipped under his penthouse door. "The higher you climb, the harder you fall." Richard became restless. He snapped at employees, barked orders, and grew paranoid about leaks. His arrogance turned into suspicion, and his suspicion into mistakes. Michael watched it all from afar, each misstep feeding into the larger trap. When Richard finally lashed out at a loyal board member, accusing him of betrayal without proof, Michael knew the cracks had widened. That was when he delivered the killing blow. He compiled everything: emails, bank statements, proof of fraud, and sent it in 3 directions at once: the board of directors, federal investigators, and a major business news outlet hungry for scandal. The timing was perfect. Richard was at a high-profile investor gala when the story broke. Michael stood outside that night, across the street, watching as Richard's phone lit up with calls he didn't want to answer. He saw the color drain from his face, saw the desperate way he whispered into his assistant's ear. Within an hour, reporters swarmed the hotel, shoving microphones in his face, shouting questions about embezzlement and fraud. Cameras flashed, capturing the fall of a man who thought himself untouchable. But Michael didn't stop there. His masterpiece was still unfinished. He had tipped off one of Richard's closest rivals in the industry, feeding him just enough information to make a hostile takeover possible. By the time Richard was arrested, stripped of his title, and left scrambling to salvage his name, his company had already been swallowed by a competitor. Everything he had built was gone piece by piece. When Michael finally returned to the building, this time as a consultant brought in to help stabilize the wreckage, the staff greeted him with quiet respect. He walked past Richard's old office, now empty, the glass walls reflecting only the ghost of a man who had once ruled through fear. Michael didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The revenge had been slow, meticulous, legendary. He had reduced Richard to nothing, not with violence, not with rage, but with precision, patience, and truth. And the greatest satisfaction came not from Richard's downfall, but from the silence that followed. A silence that told Michael he had restored the balance. That the man who fired him unfairly would never again destroy another life unchecked. Michael leaned back in his new chair, overlooking the skyline that Richard once claimed as his kingdom. He smiled faintly, knowing that while Richard's name would forever be linked with scandal and disgrace, his own would be remembered as the man who pulled the mask off a tyrant. His revenge was not just complete, it was legendary. Richard's fall from grace was swift and public, but Michael wanted something more enduring, something Richard would feel in his bones long after the cameras stopped flashing. Justice through exposure was satisfying, but justice through fear, that was legendary. After the scandal broke and Richard was removed from his throne, the man still had scraps of power left. Money hidden away, connections lingering in the shadows, a handful of loyalists who whispered that he could rise again. Michael knew men like Richard. They never stopped plotting a comeback. And so, Michael decided his revenge wasn't complete until Richard no longer believed in his own future. He began by planting doubts. Late at night, Richard would find envelopes slid under his apartment door. Inside were fragments, an old falsified contract he thought destroyed, a bank transaction he assumed buried, even photographs of him meeting people he shouldn't have. None of them were enough on their own to do new damage. That wasn't the point. The point was to remind Richard that he was being watched, that his secrets were never safe, that his past would always follow him. Richard became paranoid. He changed locks, hired private security, even tried moving apartments. But the letters always found him. A simple note one morning on his kitchen counter. Running won't help. Another left in his mailbox. The walls remember. Michael never signed them, never revealed himself. The anonymity was the weapon. The silence between each message stretched Richard's nerves to breaking point. Soon, Richard stopped going out. His once boastful parties ceased. He dismissed his staff, convinced they were spying on him. His penthouse, once filled with light and people, turned into a prison of locked doors and drawn curtains. And then Michael pushed further. He found ways to infiltrate Richard's crumbling network. Anonymous calls were made to tax authorities about funds Richard had hidden offshore. A concerned citizen tipped off former allies about his unreliable reputation. Invitations to high-profile events dried up as whispers of his instability spread. Every avenue Richard tried to use for a comeback was poisoned before it began. But the masterstroke came when Michael arranged for a message to appear on Richard's phone, an email sent from his own personal account, though Richard knew he hadn't written it. It was short, chilling. It's over. Stop fighting. Richard stared at it for hours, convinced someone had hacked into his life, controlled even his voice. In truth, it was Michael. He had hired someone skilled enough to break into Richard's digital world, to leave tiny signs that he was no longer in control. Messages sent to himself. Files altered. Numbers rearranged in his accounts. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to make him feel his sanity slipping. By the time investigators officially closed Richard's case, he was already a broken man. His fortune diminished, his allies gone, his mind unraveling under the pressure of shadows he could never escape. Michael had destroyed not only his career but his peace, leaving him to rot in the echo chamber of his own paranoia. Michael, meanwhile, thrived. He had rebuilt his name, secured new work, and earned a quiet respect that came from resilience. He never told anyone the full extent of what he'd done. That secret he carried alone, like a hidden flame he could glance at in the dark. And sometimes, late at night, Michael would picture Richard pacing alone in that empty penthouse, curtains drawn, eyes darting at every sound, waiting for the next note, the next photo, the next reminder that he was not free. That was the true revenge, not simply taking everything from Richard, but ensuring that Richard himself became the architect of his own prison. Michael's vengeance had transcended justice. It had become legend.